January 14, 1945, northwest of Cologne, Germany, 18,000 feet. The sun sits just off the wingtip, hard, white, needle bright. A box of B-17 seconds holds level on the run-in. Far above and behind the specs arrive exactly as expected. Faux 190 seconds and 109 seconds, dropping out of the glare wings, rocking guns armed. They have done this all winter. Break the escorts, carve the bombers, be home before the tanks are empty. Another short-leg escort, they tell themselves, rolling into the dive. Zoom and climb. They'll fall away. 2 thunderbolts slide up from the cold blue like doors closing. No flare, no chatter. The lead P-47 trims once settles the sight. The German in the slot blinks. Why is the American not flinching? The angles do not open. The distance does not change. The shape in the glass stops swimming and becomes a fixed thing. 850s open together. The first burst is a wall tracer's, stitching a straight, merciless line through the left-wing root of the Fokker Wolf. Paint lifts in glitter. Oil spatters the canopy in black freckles. The nose wrenches, then refuses to answer. A second squeeze, 1 heartbeat walks across the cockpit rail. Glass powders. A glove lets go of the throttle and never finds it again. The second German yanks for sky, too slow. The wingman's thunderbolt has already anticipated the escape vector, already pressed his cheek to the pad, already exhaled. The convergence is perfect at 250 meters. Fire and shredded aluminum peel from the fuselage. The propeller becomes a silver wheel with no purpose. No radio call, no order. Just wind over metal and the sweet hot smell of burned oil. Late winter, 1945. The Rhineland is a machine yard of shattered towns, feeding one last artery of German industry. Rail yards at Cologne and Troisdorf still pulse at night. Bridges over the Rhine still thread men and fuel toward the front. The Battle of the Bulge has bled out in the snow, but its aftershock persists. Wehrmacht columns trying to pull back across the rivers, flak batteries thick along the rail approaches, fighter fields hugging the last pockets of fuel. If the bombers can reach deep in daylight without being carved apart, the Ruhr's heart stops. If they cannot, Germany buys weeks, maybe a month of breath. The Luftwaffe arrives to trade on muscle memory and myth. They remember seasons when a clean dive from the sun could split an escort screen and open a bomber box like a tin. They remember when the American fighters were short-legged and easily teased upward until the heavies stood naked. Even now in January, they cling to an arithmetic that once worked, force the escorts to climb and sprint, make them choose between fuel and honor, catch the heavies in the seam. The pilots who still fly have hours in type and scars to prove it, but the pool behind them is thin. The training pipeline is hurried, the instructors are at the front, and the fuel to teach the next trick no longer exists. Every takeoff is paid for out of a national reserve that is almost gone. Across the lines, the American problem is brutally simple. Hold the umbrella from the coast all the way to the aim point and home again. No heroics. No lunges that trade position for a kill. Keep the fighters layered so that a German dive has to pass through steel to reach the bombers and then face more steel to leave. That is why the tactics look boring on paper and lethal in the air. 2-ship elements welded into 4-ship flights, altitude bands, assigned arcs of responsibility overlapping like roof tiles. The Thunderbolt is the workhorse in this sector today, lugging drop tanks, climbing in deliberate spirals, giving up style for stamina. 8 half-inch guns are not elegant. They are decisive. The stakes are not abstract. Bridges on the Rhine are about to become the only exits that matter. In a few weeks at places like Remagen, any span left standing will shape the ground war. Refineries and synthetic fuel plants already cough more smoke than product. Keeping pressure on them depends on reaching them again tomorrow and the next day. A raid that turns back because the escort screen rips open does not just spare a rail yard. It preserves the Wehrmacht's ability to move hard divisions, to crush a bridgehead, and argue history onto a different line. A raid that lands with half its heavies missing forces commanders to pause, and husbands fear among crews who must climb again in the morning. Inside the German cockpits, the confidence is procedural rather than strategic. They have practiced the approach, the break, the one clean pass that dismembers a fortress, and then a climb into the thin blue where a heavy American cannot follow. What has changed quietly, fatally, is that the escorts no longer concede the angles that bought that pass. American controllers push formations to meet the attack before it becomes geometry. Flights wait in places the Germans used to own, not because someone wants a dogfight, but because the bombers must not be touched. The moment an attacker chooses the dive, his options narrow. The first American pair pins his entry. The second pair lives on his exit vector. If he commits, he must fly through 2 trigger pulls to escape. That is why the smell of burned oil and the powdered glass after a quarter-second burst matters more than any scoreboard. The sensory fact inside a cockpit translates directly to the strategic fact on a map. A pilot who expects to punch through and instead meets a wall of 50 caliber fire loses more than an airplane. A squadron that tries the same playbook and watches 2 leaders fail in under 10 seconds loses appetite. Appetite is what sends repeated massed attacks through flak into a disciplined screen. Without it, the pattern fragments into cautious jabs, and cautious jabs do not empty a bomber box. The calendar window is narrow. From late December through February, the weather opens in ragged slits. Every slit is an opportunity to rewrite the day's logistics. Each successful deep raid removes a junction the Wehrmacht needs tomorrow. Each failed escort turns the sky back into a place where German units can move by daylight and commanders can gamble on holding the Rhine. The difference between those 2 futures lives in small, ugly moments, like the one above Cologne, a sight picture that settles, a finger that does not snatch the trigger, 8 guns that draw a straight line at 250 meters. The sound afterward is not triumph. It is simply the wind over metal and the knowledge that the box will reach the target today and that tomorrow there will be another box and another. They come down steep because steep shortens the conversation. A Fokker-Wulf dives from the glare wings, heavy with cannon counting on the old math, 1 clean pass, a short burst at convergence, a bomber's wing joint turned to splinters, then a climb back into safety. The airframe likes that profile. Its roll is crisp, its nose bites when pushed, and every habit it has learned since France says escorts will be 1 step late. A Messerschmitt follows the same catechism with a leaner body and a hungrier engine nose gun meant to saw through aluminum with a handful of explosive shells. The fear they carry is practical, not mystical. If they arrive unopposed at the right angle, a 4-engine airplane dies faster than a man can finish a sentence. The Thunderbolt is built to ruin that angle. It is not the fastest on paper at 20,000 feet. It does not climb like a hawk on a winter updraft. It carries weight that offends purists. But when the sky is thick with contrails and the distances are counted in minutes of fuel, the big radial up front does 3 useful things at once. It drags air over 9 hot cylinders that keep slugging when hit. It gives the pilot a flywheel of momentum in the dive. And it tolerates abuse while the fight moves from plan to improvisation. Behind that disc of metal sit 8 machine guns that do not need romance to be lethal. Each trigger pull throws a braided rope of 1/2-inch rounds that behave like physics, not like legend. Armourers set the convergence on the ground, often 250 or 300 meters. In the air, the pilot's job is to make the target live at that distance long enough to regret it. Inside a German cockpit, the threat begins as a feeling the escorts are not late. The American pair appears at the edge of the canopy and then does not go away. Ordinarily, the solution is to bend the path, force the defender into an inefficient turn, accept a little speed loss in exchange for opening the angles. But the Thunderbolt is not trying to pirouette. It is trying to stay solid and patient and keep the sight picture from swimming. The American trims once to stop the nose from hunting and lets the airplane be heavy. The weight steadies his hands, the dive stiffens the wings, the sight stops wandering and begins to measure. Gunnery is not a cinematic chord, it is a short, harsh sentence. The 8 barrels sit in the wings, where the pilot can feel them as a single thud through the structure. Tracers are fewer than the ball and armor-piercing rounds, but they write enough neon to confirm the line. If the first second is right, the rest is bookkeeping. Fuel lines spray. An oil cooler cracks. A canopy frame that looked like a thin, dark pencil line turns into dust. A pilot who has rehearsed the egress instinctively shoves for sky and discovers that the airplane's answer to the stick is delayed and then ambiguous, as if cables have gone slack. There is no need to empty the belts. A quarter second too long, a half-inch too far inside, one correction missed while the cockpit jolt's survival collapses into the kind of luck that runs out before the altimeter stops unwinding. The German strengths are real. The Focke-Wulf's roll rate lets it pick a bank angle like a knife flick. The Messerschmitt's nose cannon makes a single hit catastrophic for a bomber. Both will still outrun a sloppy defender if given a clean dive to build energy and empty sky ahead to spend it. The American answer is to make sure the empty sky does not exist. One pair sits above the bomber box where the sun used to be a sanctuary. One pair lives off to the side where egress lines usually run. The geometry is simple. Force the attacker to fly through two separate fields of fire if he wants both the pass and the escape. A pilot who believes he will be engaged only once must now solve two problems, while his airspeed window shrinks and his horizon fills with things that do not move the way he expects. Inside the Thunderbolt, the workload is brutal but clear. Watch rate, not position. Keep the target stable in the glass, not dramatic in the canopy. Do not snatch the trigger. Press and let the recoil fold into the weight of the wing. The sight picture is truth serum. If the target line drifts toward the nose, the German is losing room to breathe. If it slides outboard, the American is late. The pilot who can feel that drift in his stomach before his eyes confirm it is the one who lives. Training pushes him to fire in short, disciplined bursts, because the gun heat will warp aim, and the airplane will triumph over a pilot who forgets that his own wing becomes a giant tuning fork when all 8 barrels speak. Survivability isn't an adjective on a poster. It's the moment the radial keeps turning after a dozen hits that would have silenced a liquid-cooled engine. The Thunderbolt's big crankcase and armor plate behind the pilot are ugly when listed in pounds, but merciful when fragments begin to tumble through the cockpit like angry bees. A German cannon shell that explodes inside a B-17 wing root is a kill. A burst of half-inch rounds that rips a Focke-Wulf's oil system open is a kill half a minute later, almost as good because the pilot can't fight and save the engine at the same time. The air fills with the sweet hot smell of petroleum. That means a flight lead will be looking for a field or a cloud and will not be leading anymore. The bombers do not have to be invincible. They have to be left alone long enough to put iron on the coordinates. The escorts do not have to be glorious. They have to be present at the exact instance when habit would otherwise carry an attacker clean through. That is why the language inside operations tents has cooled into schedules and arcs and fuel tables. Distance to target determines where the first pair sits. The thickness of flak decides how high the top cover can really live. Weather turns altitudes into corridors and corridors into traps. A defender who flies the plan with the stubbornness of a machine turns the attacker's instincts into liabilities. The German defense still bites when everything breaks right. A pilot who finds the one seam can drop through the escorts like a hammer and see a bomber fill his windscreen so completely that he cannot miss. But the odds of reaching that seam on a day when controllers feed position calls and the escorts have learned to wait where the escape lanes end have fallen below what courage can subsidize. The corner that once belonged to the Luftwaffe, that wedge of sky where the dive completed, the guns burst and the climb began, has been crowded with American metal. The price of a pass is now a pass through gunfire, on the way in and on the way out. A squadron might pay it once. It will not pay it all afternoon. When the fight devolves from plans to instincts, the machine with more margin forgives the imperfect man. The Thunderbolt forgives. It soaks a mistake that would snap the back of a lighter airframe. It holds together when the pilot pulls a little too hard, recovering from a dive, because the tracer line was almost right and he could not let it go. It forgives the extra half-second of trigger, because the aim was true and the target was about to roll out of convergence. It forgives the fragment that would have found coolant and ended a liquid-cooled engine because there is no coolant to lose, only oil and fury, and 9 pistons that do not care about poetry. What this means in the minute-by-minute arithmetic is plain. A German attacker deciding whether to commit must picture not just the bomber's wing, but 2 American sight pictures, each waiting at a different point in his path, each able to write a straight line across his canopy at the distance where escape becomes a theory. A defender deciding whether to chase a crippled enemy into a climb must remember that his real job is not to tally victories, but to be here at this altitude when the next pair drops from the sun. The man who obeys that boring, merciless logic keeps the box intact. The man who breaks formation to celebrate a kill writes a story the ground crews like and the operations officers hate. So the fight becomes survivability translated into geometry. Geometry enforced by discipline. Discipline delivered through machine habits that feel like fate in a cockpit. The 850s do not care about pride. They care about time on target, about a sight that has stopped trembling, about distance bled to the number the armourer dialed in last night under a bare bulb. When the burst comes and the glass at the edge of the enemy canopy turns to dust and the engine note changes from a song to a cough, the pilot, with a calm hand, has done nothing dramatic. He has simply refused to gift the myth its old angles. That refusal, repeated across a dozen pairs in a dozen altitudes, keeps the bombers level. Level is enough. Level means the junction explodes, the bridge takes a hit, the plant coughs smoke. Level means the war moves forward one more day, carried on the back of machines that were built to turn fear into trajectories and trajectories into endings. He keeps the trim tab nudged where the nose stops hunting, and the reticle sits like a coin held between two fingers. The canopy frame hums from the drop tank he jettisoned a minute ago. The airplane is lighter, now steadier in the dive. Cold air leaks at the sill and tastes like metal. The intercom is quiet except for the clipped breathing of the wingman tucked 100 yards off the right. Sunlight flashes along the leading edge each time he eases left to keep the bomber box centered in peripheral vision. The B-17 seconds look slow and inevitable, silver barns with tails that wag by fractions when flak bursts bump the air. Far behind them, a seed of glare sprouts wings. One speck becomes two, then four, sliding down the sun the way they always do. He calls nothing. He has learned that the first gift to the enemy is chatter. The second is adrenaline. The controller's voice earlier was enough. Bandits, high nose northwest of Cologne. That is already true. Today's job is as plain as a wrench, keep the angles boring. Let the enemy choose a line that passes exactly where the guns are most honest. The Focke-Wulf that will matter chooses a brisk, clean slope. It comes in with the assurance of a drill repeated until the hands know it better than the mouth. The German expects the American Escort to slide wide to bite at the bait of a crossing shot and bleed its speed. Instead, the Thunderbolt barely turns. A nudge of rudder, a breath out to settle the shoulders, a tiny roll to fix the reticle just ahead of the oncoming spinner. At this range, the sight becomes a truth machine. If the dot floats, you are still thinking. If it sits, you are already winning. He does not feel brave. He feels busy in a way that clears the head. The engine is a round, patient thunder behind the panel. The stick pressure is heavy, almost parental. The gun button sits under a glove that shines with cordite oil. He presses, not yanks. The airplane answers with a single physical thump as 8 barrels wake together. The tracers are few, but they describe a line that walks into the German wing route like a man stepping through a doorway he has used all his life. A sudden spray of black freckles blooms across the distant canopy. Then the speck is no longer steady. It twitches and slides, and the nose sags as if a tendon somewhere inside has snapped. His thumb relaxes. He can feel the heat in the wings and imagines the gun belts writhing like live things that want to keep talking. He does not let them. He expects the second attacker to go vertical. Instead, it hesitates, an instinct caught between pride and physics. That breath of delay is the difference. The wingman has already curved to where the escape will be, not to where it is. 2 contrails cross behind the bomber box like chalk. When the German finally yanks for the sky, the Thunderbolt on his flank is waiting at the top of the arc with the sight picture ready. A second wall of half-inch rounds stitches the space a heartbeat ahead of the German cockpit, and the prop becomes a silver wheel with no work to do. The sound in the American's headset is only his own breath and a dog whistle hiss as the slipstream curves around the mirror. He does not say splash. He says nothing at all. The radio discipline is a rope they hold together. He eases power a fraction to keep from running through the bombers and glances once at the fuel gauge. The number sits where it should for this point on the leg. He checks the sky above the sun, then the gap over the tail of the last B-17, where a clever man might try to slip a knife. The flak pattern ahead is a row of grey cauliflowers pluming on schedule. The B-17 seconds keep their heads down and their speed constant because that is how 4 engines live. Across a few hundred yards of very hard air, The German who saw the first burst wears the shock on his tongue. He had prepared a single economical sentence for the intercom: brake right. The word brake never makes it to the end. The canopy frame went from pencil line to grit in a blink. Oil, sweet and hot, blew up the left side and salted his lips. He moved to squeeze the trigger and felt the stick go spongy, as if the airplane had turned liquid beneath him. He yanked anyway because there were always one or two last chances, and the habit of grabbing them is older than fear. The horizon disagreed. The nose wallowed, then shuddered, then settled into a slope that did not answer to facts. He had come to the dive with a clean mind. The pre-flight had been a voiceless prayer. The belts seated, the oxygen line snug, the throttle stop checked with a familiar nudge. The ground crewman's hands had been black to the knuckles with winter and oil. They had looked at each other and not smiled, because it was childish to share something you could not keep. He had told himself, as he always did, that the plan would beat chance, drop out of the glare, aim at the seam between escorts and heavies. One short burst where the wing joins the life of the bomber. Climb into thin blue where the fat American could not follow without panting. He had believed it because believing made the numbers tidy. The first American appeared where nobody respectable appeared up-sun and patient. The second appeared where escape belonged. That was when the body knew ahead of words. Something old went cold in the chest. He kept flying anyway, because hands are stubborn. The engine note was smooth until it was not. It coughed once, and the vibration changed, and a fine tremor came through the rudder pedals like knuckles rapping wood. In the mirror, the light turned into lines, then into nonsense. He thought briefly of fuel of the flight home at a metered climb that would bring them across fields he could walk if he had to. That thought evaporated with the glass. Back in the American cockpit, the smell is cordite laid over hot aluminum and the faint sweetness of glycol from a bomber wounded ahead. He rocks his wrist to check 6 through the little mirror, sees only sky, and his wingman exactly where he belongs, a comfort more real than any voice. The temptation to chase the falling shape is a dog tugging at the sleeve. He lets it tug and does not move. The job is not to decorate the nose with emblems. The job is to be here precisely when the next pair drops from the sun, thinking the play will unfold the way it did last winter. He can feel the machine choosing for him in good ways. The big radial forgives the dive a shade too steep. The thick wing forgives the half-second of extra trigger when nerves wanted a clean final sentence. The armour behind the seat forgives the flak chip that smacks the canopy rail and spiderwebs the corner of his view. The forgiveness is not mercy. It is design hardened by men who expected nerves and made room for them. That room is what survival feels like from the inside. The squadron net remains dry. Short calls, altitude numbers a vector from the controller that would bore a listener and delights him because it means the ground still owns the picture. He slides back a few hundred yards to reset the geometry. The wingman tucks without thought. Ahead, a bomber's waist door opens and a stream of empty casings glitters like rain caught in a theatre light. The big ships are working nothing more, nothing less. He watches another German dive start and die in the mind before it dies in the air. The angle is wrong by a whisper. The attacker feels it, he can tell by the way the nose wavers, by the fractional delay before the guns speak. Men who own the sky never delay. The German drifts, searching for the old pattern, and chooses not to choose. He levels a hair early and peels to look for a softer seam. That, more than the black smoke from the wreck behind, explains the war to him. Appetite is going. Habit without appetite is just a program running out of power. The flak thumps get heavier as they pass the last bend in the river. The altitude band tightens. He thinks briefly of the ground below rail lines, like dark stitches, a yard crowded with cars that from this distance already look abandoned. He thinks of the men down there who are moving fuel from one place to another, and how the only honest thing he can give them is time without sky. The B-17 seconds take their turn. The formation exhale is visible in the way the tails relax half an inch. He resists the human urge to comment. There is nothing to say that will help. On the way out, the sun is behind them, and the wind noise settles into a steady old ship moan. He looks once more to the high right, because that is where the day can still go wrong, and then to the fuel, and then to the engine gauges he could draw from memory. Every dial tells him the same story. Do the boring thing another 20 minutes, and the box gets home in better shape than yesterday's. He feels neither triumph nor pity, only a tired contentment that has its own gravity. The hands fall into a rest they have earned. The air smells less like burning and more like winter again. He will grease the wheels onto a steel runway that throws the noise back into the cockpit and taxi past men with chapped faces and red noses and eyes that squint at the sun because they've been living in hangar light since October. He will say little because truth shrinks when overhandled. A crew chief will thump the skin under the wing and cock his head for the story the metal tells. The story will be short. The belts are low. The guns speak true. The sight holds if you breathe out first. The myth dropped out of the sun and met a wall. The rest is wind over metal and the warm, guilty relief of still being here to fly the next morning. The change began as a refusal to keep losing the same way. In 1943, bomber boxes flew to targets under the assumption that courage and tight formation could beat geometry. The losses over places like Schweinfurt burned that idea out of the air. The lesson that replaced it was not romantic. Heavy bombers without deep escort invited arithmetic the enemy could solve. The fix was not a single airplane, but a chain fuel in ports, drums in depots, trucks to dispersal, drop tanks hung before dawn, controllers on radios, flights raised into the sky at staggered minutes so that the umbrella had no seam. Range came first. The air war over Germany is a problem of miles and minutes are bought with gasoline. The Americans stretched their fighters by turning fuel into a cargo item that could be used and discarded. Paper tanks and metal tanks, 75, 108, 150 gallons. The specific numbers mattered less than the habit they created. A pilot could climb on external fuel, fight on internal fuel, and throw the empties away when the weight became a liability. That one act, punching the button and watching two grey shapes drop, rearranged tactics. Escorts no longer had to decide between staying with the box to the IP or hunting the threat. They could do both at different points in the same mission because the fuel plan was not brittle. Doctrine bent around the new range. The rule that once chained fighters tight to the bombers loosened as the commanders realized the point was not to shepherd every minute, but to kill the tool the enemy used to make losses. Free hunts ahead of the stream punished the interceptors as they formed up. Strafing fields on the return leg cut the knees of the next day's sorties. Yet on days when the weather and the target demanded a wall of metal right on top of the heavies, the system could reverse the priority in a morning briefing and weld the escorts back onto the boxes like armor. Flexibility, not a holy text, became the doctrine. Inside the flights, the geometry simplified: own the entry, own the exit. The Luftwaffe's old comfort was a clean dive through one leaky layer, a short burst at convergence, and a booming climb into a slice of sky nobody contested. The Americans turned that slice into a kill zone by putting one pair where the dive would complete and another where the escape would begin. None of this required aces. It required radios that worked altimeters that everyone believed, and a habit of waiting where the other man must pass. Controllers fed the picture to men who had learned to trust a disembodied voice that said north by a few degrees and up a few thousand feet now. The map upstairs moved fighters like tiles, keeping the stream wrapped in altitude bands that overlapped like shingles in rain. Production made the doctrine credible. An airplan that eats airplanes needs a factory that eats steel and gives back wings. Engines arrived in crates like bread. Belts of half-inch rounds arrived by the million and disappeared into wings by night. Tires, guns, radios, oxygen bottles, canopy glass, everything that war turns into attrition flowed in a river that ran one direction only. A squadron could fly hard in the morning and have gun harmonization, checked panels, re-riveted, cylinders, inspected propellers, dressed by lantern light. When weather opened a gap in a German winter, the machine on the ground could surge to fill it. If a flight leader did not walk back to the debrief tent, a replacement did. Training moved men through cockpits as if the seats themselves were hungry. The enemy did not stop fighting because men lost faith in bravery. They lost fuel and time. Synthetic plants coughed smoke instead of output. The pipeline that makes a pilot out of a boy needs hours in the air that no longer existed. Instructors had been pulled forward. The next class learned in circuits with throttles held back and syllabi cut to bones. An American plan that accepted losses as a cost of strangling the opposing air arm was not cruel for the sake of a score. It was cold arithmetic, aimed at an enemy who could not replace experience at the same rate the plan burned it. Command decisions tracked reality rather than pride. When close escort bled bombers but killed few interceptors, orders changed to give fighters the freedom to seek and destroy. When free hunting left seams that a clever Gruppen commander could slip through, the pendulum swung toward welded cover. No one pretended one method would carry every day. The briefings made that clear without speeches. Altitude for each flight. Fuel gates. No unnecessary chases past the point where the job ceased and vanity began. A system can forgive individual error if the majority fly the plan. The plan can forgive a bad day if the factories keep freight yards full of replacements. Gunnery followed the same discipline. Convergence was a number agreed on the ground. Nobody argued with it in the air. Bursts were short to keep the barrels from wandering. Trigger, squeeze, not snatch. Wingmen did not chase the same carcass. One man's job was to make the hit. The other man's job was to make sure the first man landed to fly tomorrow. Debriefs punished radio chatter more than they celebrated victory claims, because words in the wrong, second cost position and position cost bombers. Even the language grew practical. A good mission was not glorious. It was on time, on target, with enough fuel to scare anyone thinking about making a last pass on the turn for home. Weather was not backdrop. It was a weapon both sides tried to wield. The Americans learned to accept missions in ragged light that formerly would have scrubbed because the system could keep a stream organized in the gaps with beacons and controllers and a deep bench of airfields to divert to if the ceiling sagged. The Luftwaffe lost more than just blue sky. It lost the ability to mass properly when holes appeared because forming up burned fuel the tanks could not spare. A scattered attack against layered escorts turned bravery into metal dust without touching the box. The point of all those dreary practice flights in English rain and the hours spent memorizing altitudes on a strip of paper was to make a grey day lethal rather than lucky. On the ground, the rhythm of maintenance embedded itself into the war. Gun crews learned the temper of each weapon, the way a medic learns a pulse. One gun liked a little more oil, another preferred a certain belt feed. Armourers walked the line with a flashlight and a pencil tapping skin, and listening as if the airplane would admit where it hurt. Engine changes happened on a schedule that ignored sentiment. If a mechanic believed a cylinder was lying, the cylinder left the airplane. Spares arrived in numbers that made these arguments easy to win. No one asked the metal to make promises it could not keep for the sake of a sortie count on a chalkboard. The Luftwaffe fought back with cleverness and courage, and on some days those still mattered. Surprise passes still opened bombers. A wise leader could use cloud to bounce an escort that thought it was alone. But the structure behind those punches kept shrinking. Fuel trucks arrived late or light. Replacement airframes reached units without the old toolkits and spares to keep them healthy. New pilots who had learned to take off, shoot a little and land at home found themselves above a foreign rail yard being asked to solve a moving problem in 3 dimensions, while men who had been flying since before the war waited at the ends of their choices. That mismatch is not a judgment of character. It is a description of war when one side can trade time for lives and the other cannot. Long-range escort also changed the bomber crews. Men who had climbed into aluminum allies under a sky that used to belong to the enemy learned to trust that if the sun speckled with dots, their own dots would appear in the same slice of glare. Trust alters behavior. Tight formations stayed tighter when they believed the slice of sky ahead was interdicted. Bomb runs over the last 5 minutes are better when minds are not busy with the arithmetic of how far a parachute drift will take a man in January over enemy country. The operational effect of 8 guns writing a straight line at 250 meters shows up as bombs landing where planners drew rectangles on maps. The fight did not become easy. It became predictable enough to plan around. The escort plan assumed losses and still made sense. The maintenance plan assumed fatigue and still produced availability. The training plan assumed the next squadron would lose leaders and still created enough competence to hold a band of sky. Each of these assumptions rested on a production base that made parts flow like water and on command choices that accepted that today's kill claim mattered less than tomorrow's sortie rate. Units learned to measure themselves against the only scale that mattered: how many bombers under your umbrella landed with holes in them, but engines running. Individual tallies belonged to paint. The metric that moved the war along a calendar was survival of the stream. When that measure improved, planners got bolder. Targets that once required luck moved into the realm of arithmetic. Deep strikes that would have been theatre events turned into work. The enemy felt that shift not as a speech but as a thinning of air around his options. If he committed early, an American sat on the entry. If he held back, another American owned the exit. If he waited for the perfect seam, the stream had already passed, and his fuel state made him a spectator. Toward the end, the last strong argument the enemy could make was the one that had worked at the beginning mass. Enough airplanes diving at once out of enough cloud at enough angles could still break something precious. The system answered with redundancy. More flights staggered bars of altitude patrols that looked dull until a dozen guns spoke in the same second and made a corridor too expensive to cross. It is not drama. It is scaffolding. The scaffolding holds even when one beam fails. None of this erases the man in the cockpit. It protects him from the worst effects of the day when his hands are a little slow, or the engine coughs at a bad moment, or flak chips the edge of his vision. It turns a near miss into a long limp home instead of a spiral. It turns a dead leader into a flight that still knows where to be and when. It turns an enemy who once chose his fights into an enemy who reads the gauges and decides to live a little longer by not committing at all. What the 8 guns did to a Focke-Wulf over Cologne is the visible edge of this machine. The invisible part is the choice a colonel made a year earlier to let fighters range ahead and cut down the opposition where it grew. The choice a quartermaster made to over-order barrels because they warp under heat. The choice an engine plant foreman made to pull men from Sundays into Saturdays because winter would not wait. The visible part is the sight picture. The invisible part is the harmonization jig in a drafty hangar, and the man with oil-black fingers whispering to a wing root with a wrench. Look at the map afterward and the trace tells the story. Climb over England, cross the water on external fuel, toss the tanks where the sun throws no shadow. Meet the attack before it becomes a diagram. Hold the band to the target. Turn for home with enough discipline left to punish the next day on the way out. Land, refuel, rearm, repair. Sleep if the weather closes. Do it again when the slit of sky reopens. The enemy's version of that trace has more ifs, fewer spares, narrower fuel margins, and a training ledger that no longer replaces what a quarter hour of bad luck can steal. In the end, the aura does not collapse in a speech. It collapses when habit meets a structure that will not yield. The man who once fell on a bomber stream, certain he could stab and vanish, finds himself pinned by an escort at entry and knifed again at exit, and somewhere between those 2 points, the mind recalculates hunger. Multiply that recalculation across squadrons, and the massed attack that once came on the 3rd minute of the run-in arrives as scattered pairs on the 8th, or not at all. The heavies keep level. The bridges take hits. Fuel does not arrive where a general wants it. Then the ground war shifts, because the air war has already moved the invisible weights that make ground fights possible. What happened north of Cologne on a cold January day is not a miracle of a single pilot or a beast of an airframe. It is the surface of a system that chose to solve the problem of range, then solved the problem of doctrine, then solved the problem of replacement, then lived with the cost long enough for the enemy to run out of hours and gas. The 8 half-inch guns were the last link. The chain behind them was the reason the burst mattered. It did not break with a shout. It broke in a pause that should not have been there. A leader rolled into the old perfect dive and felt a hesitation in his hand that had nothing to do with airspeed. The escorts were where they were not supposed to be on the entry and on the exit, and the habit that once felt like inevitability turned into arithmetic with too many subtractions. The first burst that erased a wing route over Cologne was only the visible crack. The fracture ran backward through training and forward into behavior. From that day, more German attacks began with a question mark. The old promise had 3 parts come out of the sun, split the screen, carve a bomber, vanish into thin blue. Each part now carried a surcharge. Sun glare no longer guaranteed surprise because Americans were already living in it. Splitting the screen meant flying through one pair to reach the box and another to leave it. Carving a bomber meant accepting that a defender who did not chase would still be at the right place on your climb-out. Vanishing demanded fuel the tanks could not spare if the pass took longer than clean geometry allowed. The pass always took longer than it should when the sight picture in your gun sight was competing against two sight pictures in theirs. The change showed up first in hands. Men who once rolled with a hunter's impatience began to trim a hair more to wait a beat for a cleaner angle, to look for a seam that used to appear on schedule and now did not. That beat lengthened. The pause before firing turned into a small drift past the sweet spot. A fraction late on the trigger became a fraction late on the pull for sky. Those fractions were where 8 half-inch rounds lived. A burst that once wrote confidence across a bomber's wing now wrote mortality across the attacker's canopy. You could not see doctrine in the air, but you could smell it hot oil in your mouth and powdered glass in your eyebrows, while the airplane answered the stick like a tired horse. Reports reflected the shift without drama. Formations that had announced attack pressed heavy losses among escorts became lines about encountered strong cover at multiple altitudes. Results indeterminate broke off. Indeterminate is the opposite of appetite. A leader who walks back from a sortie with indeterminate in his throat will not spend his last fuel to force a second engagement unless ordered. Orders grow cautious when the bench is thin. Thin turns a knife into a museum piece. The aura that once travelled ahead of a stuffle now lagged behind it like a story people used to tell. Escorts felt the change as silence. The radio net stayed clean because there were fewer deep dives to break. The sense of constant ambush faded into a quiet vigilance punctuated by those short, hard sentences when someone did commit and paid. Bomber crews felt it as the odd luxury of thinking only about the run rather than about whether the sky would collapse in the last minute. Calm is not noise. It is the absence of a question that had lived in men's throats for 2 years. Calm led to better bombing. Better bombing made tomorrow worse for the men who had hesitated today. The loop closed. German tactics adapted, but the adaptations confessed the myth's death. Slashing attacks from the margins replaced the full deep plunge through the box. Pairs pecked at stragglers instead of punching the center. Altitude games, that once brought a chorus of engines into a single murderous pass, dissolved into solos and duets, each looking for a private seam that rarely opened. A day's fighting began to look like weather, patchy, local, annoying rather than a storm that ripped the roof off. Weather does not change wars. Systems do. The mental break is easiest to see in what did not happen. The second and third waves that used to arrive on cadence after the first went missing. Leaders decided that the flak was thicker than expected, or that the timing was off, or that the escorts were too numerous. All true enough. The part no report wrote was the moment a man saw 2 thunderbolts close a door on his exit, while his wingman somewhere a few hundred yards off swallowed the same vision and felt his own throttle hand lighten. You can order a formation to dive. You cannot order a hand to press a trigger exactly when a mind flinches. That flinch multiplied by units short of fuel and shorter of veterans is how myths die. The result reached the map in small practical ways. Deep raids stopped looking like heroic one-offs and started stacking on calendars. Rail yards that used to catch breath in between poundings became offices for men who stamped paperwork beside holes. Bridges upstream took hits, while downstream crossings were still smoking because the stream arrived again before repairs could hide. Fighter fields that used to host confident morning takeoffs became places where men counted cans before deciding whether to scramble at all. When the sky no longer offered ambush on demand, the ground had to move on defense. Defense spends lives to buy hours. Hours ran out. Nothing in this shift claimed moral superiority. It claimed endurance. The American plan asked its pilots to be boring at the right times to live where angles converged, to shoot short and true, to come back with fuel in the tanks and the urge to do the same tomorrow. The German reality asked its pilots to improvise exits from traps they used to set to ration courage by the liter, to carry an airplane's last clean pass like a coin you spend only once. The coin kept landing on its edge and rolling away. Somewhere north of Cologne, a young man who had expected a clean diary line broke Escorts scored home, sat in a dispersal hut, and stared at his hands, while a mechanic wiped oil off a cowling with a rag already black. He did not speak of fear. He spoke of angles closed and no room and guns everywhere. That vocabulary is the grave marker for a legend. On the other side of the lines, a pilot filled a form with times and headings and wrote nothing in the box for claims. He ate, he slept, he flew again. Routine is what myths cannot survive. Call it what it was, the end of an arrangement with the sky. The men who had once believed that a dive would always gift them a target and a climb would always gift them escape, discovered that both gifts had been revoked by a structure that refused to leave seams. From that week forward, most decisions tilted toward living to see home rather than proving a point at the center of a box. The point proved itself anyway. The heavies reached their marks. The rails and bridges failed. The next morning looked like the last, and that sameness, more than any fiery moment, was how the monster's shadow shortened until it fit under its own wing. They filed it as an ordinary mission, and lived with the consequences of ordinariness, turning the sky into a new kind of machine. What had once been a gamble, one steep dive, one clean burst, a climb into thin blue morphed into calendar entries and altitude diagrams. Controllers penciled bands and fuel gates. Armourers learned the temperament of a gun by January weather. Pilots learned the value of being dull at the exact moment aggression promised spectacle. On the map, the effect showed in slow arithmetic. Rail yards that had breathed between strikes began to cough. Bridges that had been patched in the night stayed broken longer. Synthetic plants kept coughing smoke instead of producing synthetic litres of fuel. Fuel shortages altered timetables and forced German commanders to choose which roads to hold and which to surrender. The bomber stream that had once needed luck now needed discipline, and discipline was a renewable resource. America could buy with factories and spreadsheets, while Germany could not replenish men and hours at the same rate. Squadrons changed their vocabulary. Bravery did not disappear, it was rerouted. Words like probe faint hold replaced paeans to lone heroics. Claims were recorded, survival rates were celebrated. Training was compressed into practices that created habits, altitude, arc convergence, so that when nerves tightened, a pilot's hands already knew what to do. Maintenance schedules became moral acts. A replaced cylinder was not a confession but a promise that the stream would fly again tomorrow. On the other side of the lines, the change felt less like defeat and more like attrition made precise. The Luftwaffe still struck with skill and courage, and sometimes surprise still opened a seam. But those seams grew rarer. Young pilots without hours found themselves asked to improvise where their elders once counted on instinct and fuel. The loss was not just metal. It was time in the air, the slow currency with which expertise is minted. When the bench runs thin, audacity becomes expensive. The real legacy was behavioral. The daily grind of doing the boring thing, show up on altitude, hold the band, fire short and true, became the lever that nudged strategy. Deep strikes moved from being dramatic exceptions to recurring outcomes. Railheads emptied, bridges failed, logistics narrowed. Ground commanders found themselves reacting to attrition inflicted not by spectacular blows but by a steady refusal of the sky to yield. War is often decided by the boring arithmetic that feeds armies. This was one of those arithmetic moments. Memory kept the detail. Mechanics would later hum the right pitch for a gun in January. Pilots could sketch the exact altitude where a panther of the sky used to hide and recall with the odd private gratitude what it felt like to be the first pair over a box. Film cameras, grainy and ugly, circulated in briefings, not for hero worship but for training. Here is the sight picture that means you will live. Here is the seam that kills appetite. Questions remained subtle and economic. Did the margin of 8 half-inch guns close a window that would have stayed open another month if factories had been slower? If the escorts had failed to hold discipline, would the Ruhr have stayed a little more alive? Would bridges have been repaired faster? Would the campaign have looked different for ground commanders who count days the way others count breaths? These what-ifs are not academic. They are the axes historians and engineers will turn when they measure consequences. The cold fact is simple. On that January day, the sky's accounting shifted. The forms men filled out in operations rooms grew steadier. The calendar bent toward more raids completed and fewer returns in flames. And somewhere ahead on the channel of the series is the next test, steel on steel, on a cobbled street when a supposedly perfect medium tank finds what the other side's industrial math will actually allow.